Ani, Wabonanong Indigenous Cause, Minnewanka Kekandotum, Bawatingnan Dojaba, Anishinaabeg Dao. My name is Elizabeth Lapensée. I'm a designer, artist, and writer of games, comics, and animation, and I would like to share with you Along the River of Spacetime. Along the River of Spacetime is a virtual reality game in which you activate teachings related to the stars to restore waterways in Kwejong, which means where the rivers meet or where one body of water flows into the next. To begin, I'll describe the design. At the beginning of the game, you open up within a wigwam. All of the environments are created from 360 real-world footage that was taken seasonally over the course of a few years, all along the same river system within Kwejong, or what is also understood as the greater Lansing area in Michigan. Right away, you're given instructions in English to look up at the opening in the wigwam and notice that there are stars slightly faded out in copper.
Look to the sky and focus on each star to bring them into form until they become a constellation.
As your gaze moves over those stars and your focus and stillness is concentrated, they come into form. When you alight all 3 stars, you are then prepared for full immersion and teleported to the beginning location. You travel this way between landscapes which change in a nonlinear manner all along the rivers, and given challenges to connect various constellations which are rooted in Anishinaabe ways of knowing. You must very likely and very hopefully understand these stories, preferably before playing the game. The game coincides with art prints, which can also be streamed live in loops, which was the case at the Science Gallery in Detroit, Michigan, or you can make the effort to learn about the constellations, or you are someone who has already been receiving these teachings, which is ideal because Along the River of Spacetime, while engaging with Anishinaabe star knowledge, also honors protocol by not explicitly sharing the stories which are only told when snow is on the ground, but rather focuses on the science of the stars and the alignment of the constellations, which are very faded out. And if you pay really close attention and look very carefully, hopefully one by one, you will be able to start to form the stars into a constellation. Once a constellation is complete, you see it in its full form and listen to water teachings told to you in Anishinaabemowin, and also see florals of medicinal plants, of foods, fade in a light before you are again teleported to the next location in a different season, in a non-linear way. All along the way, you engage in different constellations. There's OG, the Fisher constellation, which is very well known. Understanding that you are connecting to teachings about root systems, interconnected with plants and the vitality there. You come across Ajijak, the crane constellation, wherein you are listening to how sound vibrations impact the waters. All along the way, from level to level, you are also listening to music by Exquisite Ghost, who is a really incredible musician who does beats with the kind of work that he does. And he's taken sounds from water, sounds from birds, real-world sounds, much like how I mix real-world copper or real-world water as textures in the art that I do. He mixes in real-world sounds into these soundscapes and music. And so all along the way, you're getting different experiences from level to level. Of course, there's Wintermaker. Understanding that as the climate crisis takes hold, there's this constant back and forth struggle between Wintermaker and Nanabush or Nanabojo, and this juxtaposition of spring and winter is never really clear, which is something that was revealed to me along the way with the process of developing this game, and I'll get into more in a little bit. This is so important as a teaching because when the waters freeze, they turn themselves, and in doing so replenish themselves. So without that deep freeze that's so important, then our waters are less able to cleanse themselves on their own. You come across Name, the sturgeon constellation, with the understanding that when we take care of the waters, we also then tend to the plants, which are so vital. And here we have nettles growing in, and the place in which you reveal Name is a place along the river where nettles grow, but are known to be unsafe to gather because of toxins running in the rivers. And of course, nettles are a medicinal plant. We can either fry them up and eat them, or dry them and make them into a tea. But unfortunately, the medicinal properties are then, in conflict with the toxins that they can pick up from the waters. Now, in this case, mayfly, or Omimise, is actually a new constellation. As Anishinaabeg, the way that I understand it is that we are scientists, and we too can look to the stars and see what would be new stories, while also reinforcing traditional stories. The conversation around the Mayfly constellation originated from understanding how we look to the waters and life in the waters to help inform when the waters are healthy. And so we know that if there are insects in the waters, that is actually a good sign. That's not something that we should be concerned about or trying to remove those insects. But rather, especially in the case of mayfly, that's an indication that the waters are thriving. And so when we look to the stars, often the teachings reinforce how the waters reflect those stars back. And so if the stars can reflect the mayfly and the mayfly can reflect back to the stars, then it's creating a reciprocal relationship between star knowledge and water teachings, with the understanding that really this is what we should be looking for. When we're talking about walking the land and singing to the waters, we could also understand to look very, very closely. It takes immense patience to really focus in on every single star. And so in doing so, it reinforces the importance of really slowing down and being with the river and looking very closely for insects. And sometimes that means using tools, not just looking with your eyes, but looking through tools in order to see how healthy a river is. you come across Migazi, the eagle constellation. Understanding here, the trees support the movement of the waters. Their root systems are connected. And how vital it is to have the presence of eagles. In Kwajong specifically, the return of eagles has been a sign of the well-being of the rivers. So there was a phase in which eagles no longer came to certain parts of the river, but they have returned and they have been nesting. And at some point early on in this, they were unable to have babies because there was so much foot traffic, there were cars, lots of activity going on, and so they were not successfully nesting. Well, in more recent years, the city took it upon itself to actually restrict parking in a particular area where one of these trees were, and the eagles were able to actually lay eggs and nest up and carry on that generation that are able to have babies in Kwajong, thanks to people taking the time to notice that if we do not make the effort to cut off access to particular trees and areas of the river, then we will not see the return of animals who are vital to the ecosystem, reinforcing how from stars to water to land to animals to insects, we are all connected. And then there's Mignak, the turtle constellation, in which you come across a body of water which is connected to dams. Now, while dams have stopped the natural flow of waters in Kwajong, life does carry on. There's life that carries on at the river's edge. During the making of this game, I came across a mama turtle who was traveling up from a river, and she had settled into laying her eggs just up on the land. And so there are moments in which, as you walk the land, and especially when you're working with a game that requires being on the land, you can see that there are these really beautiful moments of life, and if there's any way to reinforce that, that's really important. With turtle here is Monoman, wild rice, which is something of an issue still in the area of the Kwajong. Wild rice once did grow, is no longer growing, and there are restoration efforts that are being discussed to renew that within the mid-Michigan lands. So in terms of process, along the River of Spacetime was first inspired by me walking along at Gitchiasini, which is a big rock, or big rocks is another way of naming it, which was a bit of a hideout place for Anishinaabe people at some point in the 1800s. There are these sort of like coverings from the rocks that people could camp in very quickly. They wouldn't have to set up camp. And so it was a safe place to travel along the river. And there was an ice cave there that was just brilliantly beautiful, filled with ice. And I was able to get photos of it. And it inspired getting together 360 footage of the area. At the time, the big new thing was the Omni Pro 360. It was like $5,000 US at the time. And so I had invested in it, but by the time I was able to get the equipment out onto the land and in that area, which you actually, the rocks, there's sandstone rocks there, and you actually have to climb down a bit of a ways, the weather had changed. Beyond the point of just, year to year, okay, you're watching for cycles of winter, but rather this chaos had emerged within that passing, where you could never quite get the ice crystals exactly the same way again. The cave was never quite filled with ice the way I had seen it and the way that had inspired this project to begin with. But what I did learn through it is the importance of paying attention to the climate crisis that we are currently in and understanding our relationship with the land and the waters as we work with technology. What is the impact of the technology? How is it that we can give back? And so along the way, with walking along the land, of course I'm offering sema, tobacco, all throughout the process of developing this game. But not just that, right? It's tending to the plants when you see that there's old growth that needs to be cleared away for those plants to grow in healthier. It's noticing when there are invasive plants that are choking out the traditional plants while you're walking along the river and making sure that those are pulled away so that the traditional medicinal plants, those that are there for foods, can have a better chance to grow in. And along the way, really understanding our responsibility as people who are working in technology and interactive design. How is it that we can give back to the lands and the waters, especially considering the kind of technology we're working with? Despite the fact that I had gotten this, what was at the time a very advanced camera, I ended up during the end of the project, I had already had a prototype out, the demo, out at the Science Gallery Detroit, and I switched up the demo for new footage from the Insta360-1X because at a fraction of the cost, that camera is like, at the time it was 500 US. I think it's dropped to about 400 US at this point. And the irony was that even with this, massive camera with multiple lenses, it actually ended up being more cumbersome for the stitching process. There were a lot more issues with pixelation. And really not a lot of point to it when you're working in virtual reality. You really do not want blurriness in virtual reality because it will make people feel unwell, right? And even still, even with this new camera and with having taken footage for 3 years, starting in 2016 and then all the way up until now is like 3 to 4 years of trying to get that perfect winter. It just never happened. Snow would fall and ice would form, and then it would get very hot and thaw very quickly. I saw plants grow in, thinking that it was safe, and then snow would fall again and they would die. And this back and forth that was happening all throughout, it really reflected the process of what it is to work in virtual reality in these forming spaces where nothing is quite where you want it to be yet, like in terms of the 360 film as an environment. It helps in terms of being able to sit in a fixed position, to be in one place, to give the player autonomy to look around, right? That's them enacting their own sovereignty. It helps them to not feel ill if they're able to be fixed in one place, and 360 film really helps with that as an experience. But what I traded by switching from the Omni Pro to the Insta360-1X was the amount of time that footage could be taken. So with the Insta360-1X, you're looking at minutes of footage at a time. And so if you're doing environments that can be looping, and it's okay to have rain dropping or something melting or the wind moving in loops, then that's going to work for you. And that worked for along the River of Spacetime. But if you get into anything bigger, or if you want to have actors involved in scenes and you need something longer than, a matter of like 5 minutes, then you're going to need to go for a bigger camera, and they're still in development, right? There's still a lot of refinement happening in this field. And so all throughout, it was really this balancing act between defining what was nature-driven art, 2D hand-drawn art overlaid in a 360 environment created out of real-world film. And for my aesthetic, it works. I have a history of integrating real copper and real water, and copper that I've worked with by hand, or water that I have visited and been with. Plants that have been a part of what I have tended to, really interwoven with the art that I make. And so that aesthetic worked, but it would not necessarily work for future projects. Something where you would want full 3D environments. You might want 3D objects all around you to coincide with the 360 film. But for me, it worked because what happens with 360 film is although it's 360 in the sense of being able to look around you on what is otherwise a flattened plane, right? So that plane exists wrapped around you, but nonetheless, it's still a flattening of those surfaces that's happening. And so it worked as a landscape within the context of this game. But would be something that, if you're interested in working with 360 film in virtual reality, you'd want to really experiment with. How does that aesthetic tie in with your user interface? In Along the River of Spacetime, there is no user interface. It's fluid. The way in which you reset the game is you actually have to look down at the ground and focus in on a teleportation disc. And if you sit your gaze there for about 30 seconds, you'll teleport back to the beginning of the game. But there's no menu, there's no way in which you're saving the game. It is a constantly looping experience, which was designed primarily for galleries or for community centers in which you have several users coming through and repeating the experience over and over and over again. I think with the Science Gallery Detroit, there were at least 3,000 people that went through and played Along the River Spacetime. That is a lot of people. There were youth groups of around 20 or more at one time who had to play this in succession on 3 different Oculus Go's. And the kind of design decisions that I had to make for this were things like to have it on Oculus Go, not on another headset. Oculus Go has the advantage of not being tethered. But that also meant that the game had to be scaled down considerably. It could not run off of a PC and be tethered, right, to another system. And so it had to be, to some extent, low res as far as virtual reality capacity is concerned. But again, that fits with the body of my work. Very often I work on mobile games, on board games, games that are accessible to our communities, because as someone who has lived on the other side of the digital divide, it is very important for me to make sure that work can and should be able to be downloaded, and then played without having internet access, to be played with, less access if possible. And so to even get into virtual reality at all, for me, was a big push, as a direction that I've taken a while to move into, because of that accessibility issue. And what I've learned from this is that it outmodes really quick. Very, very quickly. Like, Oculus Go doesn't even have support anymore. And Along the River of Spacetime was out on it for a year by the time that they were like, you know what, we're just not really offering support for that anymore. The good news is that prices are dropping on the Oculus Go, but Oculus isn't necessarily providing support for development on that headset any longer, and the hope would be to move to something more like Oculus Quest, obviously. But Along the River of Spacetime was built around mechanics which required sitting in stillness and focusing your eye gaze in a particular place. No need for hands. No need for that kind of movement or interactivity. And so, in a way, the design fit perfectly with the Oculus Go, and there should always be this relationship between the device as well as the design, right? These are integrated. Just as we talk about reciprocity between ourselves and land and waters, our design should have reciprocity with the device and vice versa. You need to have a relationship between these so that it makes perfect sense why you would develop something in some kind of way for a particular kind of platform. And so the next steps forward with this would be to continue to deploy it on Oculus Go and to have something that may become very archaic. It may be a matter of buying up a number of Oculus Go's so that as it is being distributed to different venues, whether that be festivals or community centers, or even in some cases homes would be ideal, that those Oculus Go's can be provided to help with the access point, right? But as with all of the games that I work on, this is a long-term process. It's a long-term relationship which you are responsible to community members for. And so when you create, you do have to be thinking about ways in which you can maintain that experience. And so for Along the River of Spacetime, uniquely as a virtual reality game, the maintenance has to coincide with gathering up and having storage for devices and maintaining those devices long term to ensure that this continues to be experienced. So with those lessons learned, I hope there are some takeaways for you about this. The most incredible thing about virtual reality is all of the experimentation that is happening and can continue to happen. And I encourage everyone to find what works for them in expressing their voices. Thank you. Miigwech.
Oh, I'm live. Okay, so now is the time for the live Q&A. So there are 2 questions in the queue. You can ask them via the chat. You can just ask them straight in the chat, or you can do it via the ask a question option. So the first question is that they love the hybrid digital real life creative process, like going out on walks, observing nature and waiting, and then merging this with digital arts. And then they're asking if this is my regular process or if it is specific to this project. It's definitely the process for me. There is one example that I like to use often, which is that as mixed, I do not want to go out onto the land and be taking from birch trees, so from traditional plants, medicines, and so on. There are knowledge carriers who do that work, right? And so something that I do is I take photos of birch and then I can reuse that digitally over and over and over again, but with less impact on the land. I tend to, of course, offer SEMA, be tending to plants as I see the need for that, and just generally be mindful of carrying on teachings that have been passed on to me mainly by my auntie, who is passed on now. But, you know, from being accountable to community members. And so I think that that's a really vital part of the kind of work that I do. And I do tend to merge. So when you look at my work and you see copper, that's very likely copper that I have actually worked with in some kind of way. Sometimes fire has been involved in some kind of way, or it has been aged and weathered over time in a purposeful kind of manner. But also, it might take the form of water, and that actually being real resonant water. And so that's why there's this sort of like mix between real and digital in my work. So thank you very much for that question. And then the second question here is, how were you involved in the music composition process? And did Exquisite Ghosts come on the walks with you for some field recording? No, I mean, Jordan is in Winnipeg. I would love to have that opportunity at some point. I went on the walks and then sent him audio. And then he also lifted some from what was like embedded naturally with the the 360 footage as well. I've worked with Jordan before. This project was different. I don't know that I would say that there's not one way to go about a collaboration. The way that one of our collaborations worked before on a choose your own adventure text musical game called We Sing for Healing was that I started to make art. He saw the art and started to make the music. And then I would listen to the music and make more art. And we just went back and forth that way. And so the work is very naturally integrated because of that. With Along the River of Spacetime, I approached him when I actually had funding. So this is one of the first of my projects where I actually genuinely have funding and I can pay people to work with me of my own accord. Like I get to manage that. And so I wanted to approach him in a respectful way and not take up a lot of his time. And so I said, here are the videos, here is the 2D art, and this is what it's looking like, and here are the sounds. And because we have worked before, I think it was easy for us to sync up in terms of what that would sound like. And I'm always really happy with his work. And so it was just like a very clear, very natural fit. And I think the only revisions were just that moving some of his sound effects around. So it wasn't changing anything in terms of his work, but just choosing, well, where exactly do these sound effects fit was really what was most important. So that's how that process worked. And I highly recommend, when you're doing this kind of work, like working with Indigenous musicians, like music and sound is so vital. And it has been really incredible to hear that come through in the work, not just in terms of like background music or looping music in game levels, but also with sound effects. It can make a really incredible difference. So thank you also for that question. And then I'm not seeing any other questions as far as I can tell. So I'll hang out in the chat for a bit here and just wait and see if there are any other questions. And then if not, just say miigwech for tuning in. And I am always very happy to help anyone with resources. If you're interested in looking at Guggenheim as a possible funding source, they are so flexible and so supportive. Just the most amazing experience that I've had with an arts grant ever. And so, if that's something that you're interested in and you're looking at how to write a proposal for that, I'm happy to share any kind of insights I might have on that process. Because I think sometimes it comes down to just sort of having the confidence to even start. Oh, you did ask one more question. Okay, so the final question, it looks like, is if I could talk a little bit more about my form of understanding of different forms of Indigenous knowledge, meaning like scientific or Indigenous. Yeah, it's a sticky question. That's a sticky question. So the way that I understand is really largely because of my mama, who's Grace Dillon, and she is really foundational, coined the term Indigenous Futurisms. And she also talks about what she refers to as Indigenous scientific literacies, and then other Indigenous scholars have referred to Indigenous scientific literacies as well, which means that our stories pass on science. And so I kind of, what I have come up against is that I have to use the phrase culturally rooted science ideas. And then that seems to be passable by the wider judgment of what is and is not science. And so another framing is traditional ecological knowledge. And this is understanding that we are scientists. There have been generations upon generations of observations. There has been work done, connections and understanding interrelatedness, especially in regards to ecosystems. And so my hope is with the work that I am doing to find a way to visually or through game mechanics, that is the actions one can take or the interactions that make up the core of a game, reflect those teachings, those ways of knowing, right? Understood as truth and not as something that needs to be proven or, debated, but rather understanding that there is actually a very vast and very deep knowledge that can be conveyed through storytelling, but also through our art, and then also through engaging players in interaction in a game. And then in terms of work I would recommend looking at, if you're interested in more of that, would obviously be Loretta Todd's work. She was the creative director for the game Coyote Quest, which is connected to the show Coyote's Crazy Smart Science Show, which is for Indigenous youth. But also then there are a myriad of Indigenous scientists, I think especially like Megan Bang is a really incredible scientist who's doing a lot of work with education on the land. And so making sure that youth are reconnected with land and understanding the importance of those connections in learning. Yeah. So I guess I'll give it like another minute here to see if there's another question. If anyone's interested in actually trying to like play along the River of Spacetime, it is locked in festival and gallery distribution. This is something I'm trying to learn and understand actually myself, is that it is important to have a release schedule for some of your work in this regard. And I'm really terrible at that. Like I'm not the person to look to for that. I make a thing and I put it out there and then I've already moved on to the next thing and I'm not really thinking about it. So I'm really trying to learn, especially to honor the Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship for the support that they offered for this project, and then how those kinds of projects generally move. It's much more like a film in terms of entering a film circuit and then going on its process for a while. And so I think that with Along the River Spacetime, I am happy to share access via email addresses, which would be like a one-on-one exchange. And so if you yourself have an Oculus Go headset, I am more than happy to share this work with you so that you can experience it for yourself. Yeah. So basically just email me and then I'll set you up until it's ready for public release. It's effectively like ready in terms of the design, but I am trying to do my best to actually follow a process and a protocol. It will be in Geneva, Switzerland this upcoming year as a part of a large exhibition. And then there are some other exhibitions in place as well, depending on how travel works out and what galleries are going to be able to do as timelines get pushed back right now. So I cannot say dates of when the game will be distributed places, but I still want to make sure that everybody knows I'm still doing the same thing I always do with my work, which is, providing access. It just is like a more of a one-on-one ask in this case. Oh man, there's more questions. I thought I could get out of this part. This is why I did the pre-recorded video. Okay, so can you tell us, this is a great question, can you tell us why you chose to develop video games and how someone may get started as a dev? I have a whole little article about this and also a video as well, because that would be a whole other presentation. I can talk about it so much because I love games. I love developing games. I chose video games because I love games. I'm just a geek. I am more like into the nostalgia factor of it. And growing up is just, I wanted to play games that I could identify with, and there were very few of those. And so the longer that I've been involved in this, the more it's like I get to kind of bounce between the art mode and the indie dev mode, and then working on commercial projects as well. And so there's no one right path. There are many paths. How you would get started is just start making games. You do not have to have access to game engines and, to do that necessarily. You can start with pen and paper, and you can use, toothpicks for putting together pieces on a board game, and, index cards, and whatever little pieces you have to start to develop a world and how do the interactions work. But beyond that, I would say that there are a lot of great tutorials on engines like Unity available. And then there are ones that will be more restricted, like RPG Maker, but it's a good place to start if you're interested in making a top-down RPG. I myself would love to get into Unreal. I do not have a computer that can run Unreal, but there are a lot of really amazing free resources on that. So if you do have access to something of that scale, that's a really great direction to go in because of procedural generation. And like Epic put together, I think it was a library of at least 10,000 assets. I can't remember the exact number, but they're like all free environment textures and different kinds of aspects that you can use in a project in Unreal. So this is why I shouldn't talk about this, because I can go on and on about it. But really, if you're very interested, just get in touch with me. There are a lot of possible resources. And I think usually figuring out how you start in game development is really about starting to figure out what roles you want to fill and just starting to do that work. And understanding that if you're familiar with the game Doom, that's from, well, John Romero was a programmer on that. And John Romero is Yaqui and Cherokee and also Mexican. And he is completely self-taught. He taught himself how to code in libraries and also in a store, like a tech store off of a computer they let him use. And so to compare like where he was to where we are now, there's so much more access. And so I just really encourage you to start making games. And then I think the last question is, what other projects am I working on? I think the NDA is actually clear now, so this is the first time I can really talk about it. I am working as a writer on the game Weird West, and it's very weird. It is the Weird West. It's an interesting game to work on because it is commercial scale and massive. Right now, my brain is a bit fuzzy because I am working on what will end up being at least over 6,000 lines of non-player character dialogue. And to do that, you work in something like Google Sheets or Excel sheets, and you're literally coming up with like 5 different ways of saying you got damaged or you got hit or, the player character got hit. And you've got to come up with at least 5 for every personality type that you're working on in the game. And then there are multiple personality types. And so it's quite a bit of work to be involved in a game of this scale, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity, and it's been a really interesting experience. They, as a company, Wolf-Eye Studios has really cared about representations in games, and they've gone so far as to adapt in weapons that have not been seen in games like this before, this top-down immersive style game. There will be new things that will happen out of this. And so I'm very excited to see that happening. And then there's some other things I'm working on that I just cannot talk about yet, but I'm always excited to get to that point where, that work is available. There's one more question. It never ends. Do you have any links or ideas to learn about nonlinear storytelling? Actually, I teach a class on game writing. If there's a way for you to get your email address to me, I would be way more than happy to just share my class with you. It's a 15-week long class. It's all on Google Docs. You would be able to walk through all of the exercises, and I have all of the readings as PDFs available for free. So you don't have to like buy books or buy any resources. A lot of the game writing tools or narrative tools you can find free versions of, or they are free, or they come with a trial. And so nonlinear storytelling is a really very kind of like flexible place to get into and get started with. And then I would very likely just like work more closely with you just to see what kind of nonlinear storytelling do you have in mind, and then see what tool is going to best fit that process. But it can all start with just like understanding nonlinear storytelling, because that in itself within industry can be sort of a phrase that has different meanings. So nonlinear storytelling might be like a procedurally generated world, or it might mean branching storytelling that has many different paths. But more and more people are seeing branching as actually linear because it's so limited compared to procedural generation. And that's part of why I'm writing so many dialogue lines for the non-player characters in Weird West, is that although the storyline that you go through is fairly linear and has branching paths, all of the non-player characters are procedurally generated and to add that non-linear feeling, and they're going to provide different experiences for every player. Like no one game will be the same, but that means a lot of content. And so trying to understand what you're interested in would be really helpful, and I would be very happy. If anyone would like access to that game writing class, I'm very happy to share the work that I've done. It comes with pre-recorded audio lectures along with the text for the lectures. So everything's transcribed. Access to PDFs for readings, and then exercises as well. And it would just be up to you how much of it you actually wanted to do, because there's probably a lot in there. Okay, I think that might actually be it on the questions now, which is really great. Thank you for asking so many questions, and also for really thoughtful questions. I tend to be very technical, and I really appreciate any kind of opportunity to get into those kinds of details. It's very enjoyable for me. And so again, if anyone would like to follow up on any resources or anything that you would like to have shared with you, along with teaching game writing, I also teach theories of games and interaction design. And so if that's of interest, I also have design oriented resources as well. So thank you. Miigwech.